and I'm really excited to see the fantastic work that Kali Akuno and Cooperation Jackson have been doing for many years down in Jackson, Mississippi.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to the Struggle Video News. Some 60 Yale students and friends protested Yale's connection to the G4S company that has built the security equipment for Israel's prisons, military checkpoints, police buildings, and Israeli illegal settlements. G4S has a contract with Yale for security equipment at Yale University.
From Palestine to Guantanamo Bay, G4S, you can't get away. From Palestine to Guantanamo Bay, G4S, you can't get away. From Palestine to Guantanamo Bay, G4S, you can't get away.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Rakaya, and along with Yasmin and Ismail, I'm an organizer for Yale's for Palestine, a student-led movement founded in 2021 advocating for Palestinian human rights through cultural and political campaigns on campus. I want to begin today's rally with a land acknowledgement. We are standing today on the stolen land of the indigenous peoples and nations whom have stewarded the lands and waters of what is now the state of Connecticut. We recognize the ongoing relationship that exists between them and the land, and we stand with the continued struggle of indigenous people against colonial occupation, which is the nature of oppression of millions globally, including the people of Palestine. On a local scale, one which is directly relevant to most of us here, Yale has had a long history of actively supporting these colonial structures. From investment in South African apartheid in the 80s, to current investments that actively promote imperialism, climate destruction, and oppression, to the silencing of student activists, to the racist securitization on campus by the YPD and NHPD, the list goes on and on. Part of this includes direct contribution to and contracting with businesses that profit off the illegal occupation of Palestine. This includes G4S. G4S is the world's largest security company. Yale hired G4S to implement its security system. This means that Yale's ID scanning systems, police technology, and surveillance technology are sourced from G4S. Although G4S attempts to conceal its connections to Israeli violence, G4S is deeply complicit in Israel's illegal and violent repression of Palestinians. And because of divestments from shareholders such as the Bill Gates Foundation, which had a $170 million stake in G4S, and the Trauma Center in South Africa, G4S has lost contracts around the world because of campaigns just like this one. Pressure on G4S must continue because we see it working. Until 2016, G4S ran all Israeli prisons, where Palestinian political prisoners and children were held without trial as they're subjected to torture and abuse. Under global pressure, G4S abandoned its deals with the Israeli prison service. But G4S is still complicit. Currently, it runs Israel's Central Trading Academy for its police forces. It also holds a 50% stake in Policy Limited, which is the company contracted by the Israeli police to build and operate this national training academy. Policity is also responsible for a portion of the training of the IDF. In pursuit of maintaining control over political power and land, Israel has dispossessed, confined, and subjugated Palestinians by virtue of their identity. This discrimination is often so severe that it has led to international human rights organizations denouncing Israel for apartheid and persecution. Israeli police forces are the main organs of the state that uphold and carry out this violent repression of Palestinians. By operating and partially owning the institution that trains these forces, G4S is deeply complicit in Israel's human rights violations.
We are Yale's for Palestine, but let me be so clear, this is not just about Palestine. This is about the global pursuit of justice and dismantling structures which have oppressed for far too long. Thus, we are not just concerned with how G4S upholds violent surveillance in Palestine, but how it does so globally. G4S's U.S. subsidiary, Allied Universal, has been involved with ICE to transport, detain, and deport immigrants on the U.S.-Mexico border. They operate private prisons in the UK, South Africa, and Australia, and provide technology for Guantanamo Bay. G4S has been implicated in labor rights violations of migrants and has provided security for child detention and imprisonment. The G4S website itself has a line that reads, "In more ways than you realize, G4S is securing your world." We want to add that in more ways than you realize, G4S has embedded itself into our lives and tied us all to human rights abuses around the world. We are here to call on Yale to reimagine security with us in a way that is separate from the profiting of imprisonment, of policing, and detainment. We are here to demand that Yale ends its contract with G4S immediately. And we are here to demand that Yale stop contracting with and investing in corporations that are profiting off of death, suffering, and occupation.
All nations are born in sin. The United States, Israel, or my countries of origin, Morocco and Spain. They were all created as the byproducts of suffering, oppression, and profound grief. Our ancestors have drawn lines with blood to separate us from the other. But this fact does not determine the moral worth of a nation. What does separate nations is their capacity to acknowledge that history and try to mend it. G4S is a prime example of a company that aids in the perpetuation of that original sin. As it works to draw boundaries, it continues to enforce differences between the Jewish and the Arab, a predominantly black prison population and the respectable white American, between the Yalie and the New Havener. When Yale asks us to break boundaries and break bread in commons, an awful slogan if I may, they must also ask of us to stand up against G4S. Today we are gathered here to ask that Yale live up to its values, nothing else. We ask that Yale speak with its money rather than with platitudes to break the boundaries of the past. If Yale purports to be an example, the minimum we can ask is that it be more than a reflection of its bloody past.
Switching to DeKalb County, Georgia, activists have been calling the killing of Tortuguita in the Cop City protest tent in the woods outside of Atlanta a murder. Evidence seems to back this up. The official DeKalb County autopsy was released this week, and it showed Tortuguita had been shot 57 times. Sharon Zhang on Truthout writes, crucially, the autopsy also found that there was no gunpowder residue on Tortuguita's hands. This strongly suggests that the police lied about Tortuguita shooting first, a narrative that activists have said many times was a complete fabrication, and one that was also contradicted by an independent autopsy done by Tortuguita's family, showing that their hands were up as they were shot. More about Cop City later in the program. Coming up on Saturday, May 13th, the Gandhi Peace Award to Kali Akuno at the very new Q House on Dixwell Avenue in New Haven with its very ample parking lot. That was Michael Mills, who will be playing music at the Gandhi Peace Award with his group Rhythms from the Heart. Now, Kali Akuno in February, talking about the effort to stop Cop City, the power structure in Atlanta, the killing of Tortuguita, and a connection to Israel.
If you didn't really know that much about Atlanta, you would assume that that place was being run by Donald Trump or DeSantis, right? From the type of policies and things that they're pushing. Atlanta's a Democrat-run city. That's right. And it's a black Democrat-run city, right? A city run by black Democrats since the 1960s, the late 1960s, right? It was noted for being one of the first major cities in the South, particularly the Deep South, to have a black mayor, right? Who then shepherded in one of the most major economic transformations in the Deep South by bringing the Atlanta airport, right, or securing that contract and then bringing that airport to Atlanta. Now that airport was originally designed to be in Birmingham, Alabama. And why is this important? Although it sounds local, you got to put a lot of this stuff in geopolitical perspective, right? And so the U.S. military and the U.S. government wanted that airport in one of those two particular places because of its strategic location, both relative to how the U.S. geography fits within itself, so production and transportation, inside the United States, but also its positioning relative to, the broader game of how they monitor and utilize their military assets to try to control the world. So when you see Atlanta, you got to put it in that context and understand that Cop City is not just a local little trivial thing. This is a deep international project, something that the capital and the state and both of all these little factions are both deeply invested in, right? And so one of the things I think is sorely missing, I lived in Atlanta for 5 years, worked for the U.S. Human Rights Network for the time that I was there. And in the time I was there, worked with a group of students at Georgia State University to tackle a program called GILLY. I want y'all to look it up. I had to look it up again myself since it's been a couple of years. But GILLY stands for Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange. And this is a program that's been going on basically since the late 1980s that directly interfaces Atlanta, the Atlanta PD, Atlanta sheriffs, and the sheriffs around that region that get directly trained by Israeli military forces and have been for many years now. Now, this is just one of those particular little sinkholes. So if you think this just about, well, they need a larger shooting range or they need, hell no, that ain't got nothing to do with what this is about. And without a deeper an analysis and presentation of this piece, while the AJ piece is good, is totally out of context. Because you just think they killed Tortuguita because they were like mad or upset, or that they're pursuing this because they just don't like anarchists, or they ain't got nothing to do with that, right? This is a vital project that they need particularly to go through because they are very clear, both sides of this Democrat and Republican coin, that the next phase of governance domestically is going to have to be a brutal one. Right? They are going to have to govern or attempt to govern through more direct application of force against all of us. Not just black folks, not just indigenous folks, not just Latinos, all of us. Reason being, despite how they want to portray the economy as it's got the lowest unemployment rate since the 1950s, and the jobs are growing and expanding, but they themselves didn't tell you on MSNBC and CNN, even though all this supposedly is doing great, most of the American public, is totally uncomfortable with the economy. So you got figures that don't add up to reality, right? And they totally misalign the figures. Like if I got to work 3 or 4 jobs, just basically to make ends meet, and then have other little side hustles, whether they're legal or illegal, to make things meet, something is deeply wrong with this society and where it's going, and it cannot deliver on the goods or the imperial promises that they used to make to white folks. It's like, y'all go with this program and we'll give you these material rewards. Well, when you can't give the material rewards anymore, what does that lead to? If that's what so much that they were banking their rule on, right? And this is critical for us, I think, to understand, because it is about ideology to a large degree, why there's so many reactionary forces that have come to the fore, and why fascism or neo-fascism is growing. But there's also a material dimension to this. Like the empire cannot deliver on the goods and services it once promised, right? And if you want to break it down in some simple ways, they can't promise white men that they would have what their grandfathers once had, in the position that they once had. And once that promise is gone, the last thing that's available for them to really consolidate their rule is the stick. So they're going to be building sticks everywhere. This is just one of the more advanced columns. Like one of the more advanced columns. And I think the piece that we have to really figure out in terms of political clarity, why I asked that very subjective question. Because we have to figure out, I think those of us in this room, whether you consider yourself left or liberal, really doesn't matter. The question is, what are we trying to advocate? What is our program? What is our vision for another society, a different society, a humane society, egalitarian society? How do we work on that together despite our political differences? Because that's what it's really going to come down to real quick. And what's happening, over at Relani People's Park, is a small little exercise in there. Because folks should know, the Cop City struggle has actually been going on for a couple of years now, right? It's starting to get a little bit more currency, which is a good thing. But one of the reasons why, if we're being truthful, it hasn't gotten a lot of coverage that I think is rightly should have been getting for years, is because it's primarily been led by a group of young white anarchists, right, who've been occupying the forest. And a bunch of, liberal forces, I'm gonna call them liberals, be they black or otherwise, who are more in the mainstream of political activism being directed and guided and, through nonprofit organizations, don't want to or have been avoidant about getting engaged or being involved in something that directly necessitates direct action and sustained direct action, right? And it wasn't until there was, an execution and then some direct action in response that it's now blew up. But this is something like, if we wait too long to figure out these pieces, we wind up getting involved in the struggle at a high level when it's practically almost over. And looking at some of the plans that I've seen here recently, that Biden is trying to move through, with Bernie, one of the critical things that they seem to be trying to put on the plate around this new infrastructure, there's a lot of military stuff that's in there. A lot. Right? And in my view, that's a piece that Bernie has always been a little bit weak on, to put it bluntly, or put it mildly. So, I think, we need to start doing some deep homework on what they're proposing coming down the pipeline so we can get ahead of it, ahead of the curve, and try to start blocking it. That's the fight dimension, and then get much more clear about what it is we want to build and how is it going to take us organizing together to actually execute that. So I'm going to stop there.
Mark his words carefully. The power structure is planning a period of rule featuring violent suppression. Last week, we showed parts of the press conference announcing the Gandhi Peace Award. Dan Chodorkov, an anthropologist and co-founder of the Institute for Social Ecology, spoke from Vermont on Zoom.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak, and I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm really excited to see the fantastic work that Kali Akuno and Cooperation Jackson have been doing for many years down in Jackson, Mississippi. I first became aware of their work years ago, and we have been fortunate enough at the Institute for Social Ecology to collaborate with Cooperation Jackson over the past several years on a variety of projects. And I've also been lucky enough to become personally acquainted with, and I'd like to think friendly with, Kali himself, who is really a remarkable person who has spearheaded so many efforts that have contributed to what Martin Luther King called the arc of history bending towards social justice. And specifically, I think we need to recognize that Kali and Cooperation Jackson have really been in the forefront of developing new models for community development, which are truly ecological, truly holistic, in the sense that, as Laura pointed out in her introduction, they work on a variety of areas which are often seen as disparate: housing, food security, energy, political empowerment. They really see all of those as interconnected. They recognize the interrelationship between social justice and environmental justice. And in fact, they share the belief that we have here at the Institute for Social Ecology that we can never achieve environmental justice, we can never achieve an ecological society unless we have social justice. In fact, social ecology suggests that our futile attempts to dominate nature, which have resulted in a multiplicity of environmental crises, and perhaps most importantly in the climate crisis that we find ourselves in the midst of, all of those so-called environmental crises are really social crises, and that our attempts to dominate nature stem from the domination of people by other people. So Kali and Cooperation Jackson really try to take all of that on, using an ecological model for community development that I believe, and the Institute believes, is necessary if we are really to begin to seriously address the crises that we find ourselves mired in today. We recognize that peace requires social justice, that climate justice requires social justice, that in order to actualize humanity's potential to become nature-rendered self-conscious, nature-aware of itself, and therefore capable of truly addressing issues like climate change, is going to require tremendous changes of a revolutionary nature in our current society. And by revolutionary, I mean that we need to transform some of the underlying structures, the economic system, the political system, that have direct responsibility for creating the problems that we face today. And Cooperation Jackson has addressed those issues head on and has really developed a model that I think needs to be further explored and applied, not just in this country, but all over the world. And it's a model really for an ecological society and a peaceful society. For CJ, this is going to have to be based, Cooperation Jackson sees this really as being based in the development of local communities along ecological lines, so that they see that in order to do this, we need to create non-hierarchical social relations. We need to end the domination of particularly people of color, gay people, trans people, Islamic people, Jewish people, people who've been traditionally oppressed, that we need really to take all of that head on, and that we need to do it in a decentralized fashion, which will allow for the true empowerment of local communities, which is very much the model that they've tried to develop down in Jackson, Mississippi. They've worked very closely with ideas that are generally known as municipalism, the idea of empowering local communities through directly democratic forums for decision-making to eliminate the kinds of hierarchical and bureaucratic systems that oppress us today, and to replace them with a form of governance that really grows directly from communities and empowers individuals in communities to make the decisions that are going to affect their lives. This is a very different model of politics than the kind of top-down model that we see today. It's here at the Institute, these ideas were developed really beginning back in the 1950s by my fellow co-founder of the Institute, a man named Murray Bookchin. And Laura mentioned, or rather Stanley mentioned, that the Institute is involved in developing ideas. And we are. We work very much with theory. We're an educational institution, but we also believe that theory is meaningless unless it is applied in the real world. So our model is not one of simply developing sterile or academic theory, but rather developing ideas that can inform action. And then once the actions are taken, we can examine them, critique them, revise the theory based on our experience. And it's a model that's known as praxis. And it's also a model which we share with Cooperation Jackson. We've been very lucky in that for the past couple of years, we've been able to work closely with Cooperation Jackson. Actually, Kali himself is the coordinator of the Institute's Social and Environmental Justice Program. We offer a series of lectures, discussions. Kali did a lot of live reporting from COP this past year for us, the climate conference, UN climate conference that just happened a few months ago. And we were able to collaborate last year to create a week-long program, which was called Building Eco-Socialism from Below, which we co-sponsored with Cooperation Jackson and held here in Vermont. We attracted activists from all over the country, really all over North America, for that event, and began exploring ways in which we can collaborate further around these very important ideas. I'm not going to go on too much longer, but I think that the vision, the shared vision of the Institute for Social Ecology and Cooperation Jackson really does need to be articulated, and it's an extremely important vision which sees community development as a key to the process of social change and sees that community development being based in the creation of new forms of economic cooperation, solidarity economics, workers' co-ops, various forms of mutual aid, which sees all of this being informed by and really driven by a directly democratic decision-making process, which sees the need to create sustainable forms of energy production. Here at the Institute, we started advocating for and actually working with and building models that demonstrated the practicality of solar energy and wind power. Back in the early 1970s, we envisioned those technologies having the potential to be developed in a decentralized fashion that could be owned and controlled by communities. What we've seen instead, of course, is the development of huge industrial scale wind and solar facilities controlled by large corporations, but that doesn't vitiate the fact that the potential still exists for the application of these in a new social setting. We also, of course, see the need for the creation of sustainable forms of food production. At the Institute, we began, once again, back in the 70s, working with organic forms of agriculture and aquaculture, integrated systems. All of this really ties very directly into the kind of work that Cooperation Jackson has been doing in Jackson, Mississippi. I think it's extremely important. I salute all that they've accomplished, and I very much look forward to working with them in the future in further development and application of these ideas. I think it's very important to have living models that we could point to. And to my mind, Cooperation Jackson represents one of the most important models available to us. And we do well to pay heed to the lessons that they have to teach us. I'm going to finish up. I just want to emphasize that I think the creation of an ecological society is a prerequisite for true enduring peace. And without justice, there can be no peace. If you're interested in learning more about the work of the Institute, we've been at it for almost 50 years now. I'd steer you towards our website, which is social-ecology.org, or maybe that's an email address. I'm not very computer literate, but there are a wealth of materials available on the website, and I'd encourage you to take a look at it. And I want to thank Building Enduring Peace for the opportunity to speak at this event, and thank them very much for their recognition of the incredibly important work that Kali and Cooperation Jackson have done over the years. Thank you.
Today,
corporate media had a lot of coverage of Harry Belafonte after he passed away this last week. They showed some of his calypso singing and even had him shaking hands with Martin Luther King Jr. What they didn't show was his anti-war side. Here is a selection from his talk at an immense rally in 2003, where he and others tried to prevent the U.S. war against Iraq. Video from Democracy Now!
It's a historic and a proud day in the name of America. The world has sat by with tremendous anxiety and with great fear that we did not exist. They have been told and they have felt that what our country, with its press and the leaders in the administration have said, we today invalidate all that. We stand for peace. We stand for the truth of what is at the heart of the American people. This is not the first time that we as a people have been misled by the leadership. We were misled by those who created the falseness of the Bay of Tonkin, which falsely led us into a war with Vietnam, a war that we could not and did not win. We lied to the American people about Grenada and what was going on in that tiny island. You've lied to the American people about Nicaragua, El Salvador, Cuba, and many places in the world. And we stand here today to let those people and others know that America is a vast and diverse country, and we are part of the greater truth of what makes our nation. Dr. King once said that if mankind does not put an end to war, war will put an end to mankind. And that we have let the world know that we are in solidarity with those who seek to have other ways than war to settle our grievances.
And they don't show him from months later calling out the war crimes of the George W. Bush administration.
Even the Congress violated the statutes of the Constitution. We were not invaded. There was no threat of an enemy. We unilaterally walked into a country that had no threat to this country, and we invaded it. That's against the Constitution.
You call President Bush a terrorist?
I call President Bush a terrorist. I call those around him terrorists as well. Condoleezza Rice, Rumsfeld, Gonzalez in the Justice Department, and certainly Cheney. I think all of these men and women sit in the midst of an enormous conspiracy that has been unraveling America for the last 8 years, 6 years.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for the Struggle Video News.